Welcome back, everybody, to episode 102 of UAP Studies Podcast. I'm Louis Borges, my good friend and co-host, Jason Gilmet. How are you, brother?
I'm very good today. We have Leslie Kean, or Kane, I should say, on the show. I'm very, very excited to talk with her. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm excited when you can chat with somebody who's been doing this as long as she has, female, which is very rare. I mean, she's like the female George Knapp. Not to put either of them in a box, but I consider them in equal regard in my mind in terms of respect.
Absolutely.
Anybody associated with the New York Times, you're vetted and they scrutinize everything you do. So if you've had any kind of career for any length of time, it's because you know what you're talking about. And she's written books. She has, people. I think Michio Kaku wrote a glowing review on her website. I mean, her colleagues are like the Hal Puthoffs of the world and Jim Semivan. She knows all the big players. And we're going to ask her, where's the new information coming out? Are there going to be some whistleblowers? What's coming down with these congressional hearings? And also get her perspective on what the hell's actually going on with this stuff. Is this a real thing? Is this interdimensional? And all the usual questions. So it's going to be a great show today. Stick around. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back to another episode of UAP Studies Podcast. This is episode 102, Jay. We're here, man. We've arrived. We've somehow made it.
The 102. I love it.
Yeah, we had Jacques Vallée episode 100, Ross Coulthard, and we're super excited for 102. And in fact, the next 10 that we have booked is going to be very exciting. So, but we would be remiss if we didn't include a great mind in the field and on this topic in our discussions. We have an award-winning journalist, an author. I'll read just a few of her books. UFOs, generals, pilots, and government officials go on the record. Yep, that one right there. Surviving Death, which is really interesting. It's a journalist investigates evidence of the afterlife. And this is all conscious-based, and we are also big fans of that type of thinking and want to learn more as well. This lady's colleagues include Ralph Blumenthal and Michio Kaku, Jim Semivan. Her whole damn family are basically Congress people. I did some research on that too. Her grandfather, her uncle, her cousin. This is a lady that is no stranger to the topic of ufology and the world of strangeness. So we're very excited, and we want to welcome to the show Miss Leslie Kean.
Howdy.
I hope I pronounced it right. You prefer Kane, right?
It's not that I prefer it. That's the correct pronunciation.
Perfect. I'm picky with my name too. My name is Louis, spelled with an S, and I spell it with an E here on the show on purpose, so people don't call me Louis because it drives me nuts.
Okay, because I would have thought it was Lewis, and you would have thought my name was Kean if you read it.
For sure.
That's why I always tell people to pronounce Kane.
So Leslie Kean, you're a very well-known, very well recognizable. I mean, I've seen you on TV. I can't even count how many times. But for anyone who's out there in our viewer world who maybe doesn't know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself and what got you into all this, the world that you're in right now.
Okay, well, I could do that in 1 minute or I could do it in 15 minutes. So I don't know.
Well, we got 45 minutes to an hour, so you take your time.
I think most people probably know that, so I'll keep it brief. Anyway, I'm an investigative reporter, and back in 1999, I was working at a public radio station in California as a producer and an on-air host for an investigative news program, and just doing my job there. And then I got a colleague in France sent me this report called the Cometa Report, which I'm sure today a lot of people know about if they're into this topic, but it was an English translation, and no one had seen it yet in this country. And it was a 90-page study written by very sophisticated people, such as a bunch of generals, an admiral, the former head of the chief of police, the former head of the equivalent of NASA in France, of their space agency, a bunch of scientists and engineers. And they spent 3 years looking into UFOs, investigating official cases with great data, interviewing pilots. And these were retired people, so they weren't it wasn't a government document, but it was like a white paper that they put together to give to their government. And I ended up with this English translation of that. And I was sitting there, just looking at it from a journalistic perspective. And I was absolutely blown away by this report. And a lot of it was because of the conclusion. And this was back in 99, when the taboo was much more prevalent and people weren't really very outspoken about this topic then. And these guys said that they thought the most rational, valid, basically the best explanation for the cases they studied was the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And I had never seen that before. And they were basically saying that it's likely that we are being visited by something extraterrestrial. And, I thought this was I was like, what? This is a huge story. These guys are like generals and admirals saying this. And they went on to explain, what some of the other possible explanations might be and sort of why they didn't apply. But it was really powerful. So anyway, I just was very taken by this and looked into it. I started to look into a little bit whether, and the focus of this report was national security. So that was sort of the umbrella, it was called UFOs in Defense. What are we prepared for? And the purpose they were trying to suggest that pilots should be prepared and informed about these objects in case they ever encounter one. We don't want people making stupid mistakes that get them in trouble. So it was defense-oriented thing. So I started to look into a little bit about a defense issue, national security issues in America related to UFOs. And then I pitched a story to the Boston Globe because I was a freelance writer at the time, and I had published numerous articles with the Boston Globe on various topics. And so the short story, anyway, it was a lot of issues with getting it published. But in May of 2000, my first story on UFOs came out in the Boston Globe, and it featured that French report. And from that moment on, I was like so on fire about this topic and so fascinated by it that I basically started doing it full time and eventually left the radio station and have been doing it full time pretty much ever since. I mean, I've done other stuff too, but that's how the whole thing started. And I was just really blown away by the fact that there wasn't more. There was a huge response within the UFO community. But I thought, well, Congress is going to be all over this, the best investigative journalists of the day who work for Washington Post or New Yorker or places like that are going to be jumping all over this. And I was, I didn't know yet about how fraught this topic is with ridicule and taboo, and people don't want anything to do with it, and they think it's baloney. And so I just thought it was a great story, and everybody else would too. And it was the first step in my learning process. And it was partly that sort of silence towards the topic that inspired me to want to keep going with it and to find out what is this all about. And then I just learned more and more about even more evidence and more evidence and more evidence. And I kept publishing a series of stories in the years that followed that and got more and more involved. So that's how it started.
Have you noticed a shift at all, like within, not, before 2017, when you and Ralph Blumenthal and, I always forget her name, Helen Cooper. Helen Cooper broke the story. Before that, you had a lot of stigma still in the 2000s, even though you had come out with this amazing book in 2010. There's still a lot of stigma about this topic. Have you noticed a shift now since the story broke in 2017? Are reporters taking this more seriously? I know CNN is taking it more seriously, but here in Canada, we have a hard time with our media. Our media does not cover it seriously. And when they do, they say on a lighter note, which to me always pisses me off because it's like, how is that a lighter note? It's probably the most important thing.
This is serious business. Take it that way.
Yeah, take it that way, right?
They'll say that even after what's happened in the last 5 years, they still do that.
They're always 2 weeks behind. So if there's something, they'll wait till CNN comes out and Fox News or whatever the big organizations, and then 2 weeks later they'll mention it, but it's not a big piece. It's not like top story. It's just like on a side note with the puppy that does amazing tricks at the end of the show, like on the lighter note. So they just throw that in there, and it makes me so mad. It's like, you're not taking this with the severity that it merits, right? But have you, on the other side of the border, have you noticed a shift at all with the reporters or the journalists?
Massive shift, but what you're describing sounds exactly like what was happening in America prior to 2017.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, and then have I noticed a shift? Huge, huge shift since 2017. I mean, there are still problems, but nothing like what you're talking about, you know.
Right.
And after that, when the story broke in 2017, I mean, every media was all over it. Every media was going nuts in anticipation of the June 2021 report. You know, there was a couple of months prior to the release of that report where there was like a frenzy in the media in America. They couldn't get enough of it. And, you know, then there are lulls, and then something happens. You know, the congressional hearings got a lot of coverage. I mean, certainly the congressional hearing in May elevated the topic even more. You know, Congress isn't going to be holding hearings about something that's not worth reporting on, right?
Right.
I don't know. I'm just, I'm surprised that, but you know, these things are happening here. They're not happening in Canada. So that's maybe part of it. But in America, yes, absolutely a massive, massive shift.
I think it matters too, based on sort of how aware your population is. Like Canada has had a few, you know, Shag Harbor being a big one, but I think in terms of total understanding or total interest, it's a lot less. I mean, even this show, yeah, we are Canadian, but the Canadian market is like our fourth biggest audience. It's primarily the United States, United Kingdom, then Australia, and then Canada. So we represent a really small piece. And I don't know if it's because, again, the US has had so many, you know, good authors and well-known stories, Roswell and everything else. The UK has had quite a few. It just seems to be more of a paranormal place with Stonehenge and all that, you know, like I just think that we're a little more sleepy, and that's why we're late to the party, because it's not coming from the people. And credit to the Americans, the people got fired up and said, we want to know more about this, and you better start talking. And now there's congressional hearings. So it's going to come from the people as what's going to make this thing really roll.
Yeah, I think that did help a lot. Again, I often have to step back and remind myself that it's still only a small percentage of people that really care.
Yeah.
And
Right.
don't even know anything about this. And you kind of forget when you live in this bubble where, you know, I'm dealing with all these people all the time that are so involved. But you know, there's definitely interest. I mean, in America, I think maybe more than anywhere else. I don't know, but definitely. And you know, there are a lot of, I mean, it's still tough in the media. The New York Times, where I've been reporting for, is a paper that has so much impact that you know, it's worth just waiting for the moment where they will do a story. But they, you know, it's very, very, very difficult to get them to cover things, and we're not always successful when we bring a story to them. They just don't think it's important enough. So, you know, there's still, I think, not a lot of understanding among some media about how big this story is, what it really means, and what kind of, you know, incredible information there is to justify the reality of it and the import of it, the importance of it, and, you know, all of this. So we have a ways to go, but there's like a line between pre-2017 and post-2017 to me that are like night and day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even big name guys like George Knapp, when they were talking about, you know, having done a lot of this work right from the days of NIDS and Robert Bigelow, and having the information on ATIP and OSAP and all the rest. And he basically said if it didn't go through someone like Tom DeLonge, they weren't going to publish it. They wanted the notoriety and the clicks and everything else, even though others had done way more, you know, influential work. If it wasn't for the entertainment aspect or the sort of media awareness of, hey, here's a big name guy saying this, it kind of gave them that safety net to say, okay, well, if a celebrity is willing to go on the record, that's a good enough story in itself. We're now not so scared, you know?
It's pretty silly given that a celebrity is just one person.
Yeah.
Just else. And just has a job as doing his celebrity thing and might not know any more than anybody else. And I think the key thing is, I mean, George has been around for decades doing incredible work, and he had access to this Las Vegas. Yeah. It's really good Las Vegas station. But I think, you know, you have to go national media before, if it's really going to change the paradigm, I think. And I think it was just fell into my lap to get to do this story for the New York Times. And it was because of the, you know, the stature of the New York Times that's why everything changed. Yeah. So it's not like there weren't other people that knew a lot about it already. That's not the case. You understand what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it interesting. You mentioned that in the late 90s, French officials bring you this report. And I looked into it a little bit myself. I'm not an expert or anything, but it seemed like they were trying to do the same things then that we're doing now. So A, strip away the stigma a little bit so it can be something that, the government can look at seriously, and B, investigate if there is in fact a threat narrative. And that's become a very polarizing subject. Is it a threat? Is it not a threat? And we asked Ross Coulthard the same thing, and he said, look, it's not a threat in the sense, at least in his opinion, he said it's not a threat that they're going to come take over and it's a global domination thing, or we're going to be enslaved. But if it's something we don't know and it's in our airspace, even if they're in full control, our pilots might not be. And that is where the inherent threat is, not. But to Jason's credit, he's also chatted with people that said, yeah, well, if somebody comes and takes you out of your bedroom and does whatever they want with you, is that not a threat? Is that not something we should be concerned about? So
Highly
I'm gonna ask
illegal,
you,
for sure. Yeah.
what are
Yeah,
your thoughts on the
yeah,
threat narrative and what kind of threat?
it's such a complicated question. I mean, I would agree with Ross, that in the bigger picture, it doesn't look like we're about to be attacked. They're not like out there shooting down our aircraft
Yeah.
or threatening us in that sense. But for the Department of Defense, anything that can make incursions into protected airspace and not identify themselves and buzz around Navy ships and do it, come close to our pilots or Navy pilots, that's a threat because we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
They have to frame it that way. And from the very beginning, I remember when I spoke to Luis Elizondo, even before the New York Times story, when I was writing some things for the Huffington Post, I mean, he was very clear about that. It's a potential threat more than a threat.
Right.
And you have to look at it that way when it's behaving the way it is. And it also gives then the DoD can get involved, right? Their job is to protect the American people and to deal with military threats. So it has to go into that basket for them to get involved. But I would agree. I would agree with Ross. And I think for the individual people that have these terrifying encounters, of course, it's a personal threat for them. Absolutely. I can understand that. And that probably makes the whole thing feel very threatening. I think Jim Semivan might be an example of somebody who feels this sort of ominous aspect to it. That there's some non-human intelligence that has this incredible power and control and can do basically anything it wants, can control our thoughts, can manipulate us. We don't know if it's, we don't know what it is, where it's from. I mean, all of that is, it depends how you want to look at it, and how you define threat. But I can certainly understand for people who have had these kinds of encounters, it's frightening. Therefore, it's a threat. And maybe the threat for them is it going to happen again to me? What's going to happen next time?
Yeah.
So it's a very complicated thing, but I like the idea of shifting it a bit to the scientific realm and a bit away from the military threat realm and kind of try to balance it out a little bit more. And I think one way to do that is for the scientific community to become more involved and for us to be able to see it also as a scientific problem and not just an intelligence or military problem.
Right. And some great organizations now are starting to come out. The Galileo Project, the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. There's great people in science now that are actually taking this on. And, the stigma seems to be dying within the community now. There seems to be a lot more people going, you know what, I saw something too, actually. I should probably look into it and stop being a hypocrite, right? Which is great. I mean, it's great to see that within the community as well. Now, one thing that we covered a lot on the podcast was the aspect of consciousness. Because there's always like people saying, oh, they told me we need to raise our consciousness, or our consciousness has a huge thing to play with. What takes place after a sighting or anything like that. Like there's consciousness aspects to it. You covered consciousness in your documentary, Surviving Death, and just the fact that there's consciousness after we die, sort of like there's got to be a link there between the two, between it. So I'm just wondering, have you noticed anything, a link between the two? Is there anything similar between the two that, that you've found so far?
It's such an interesting, to me, that's like the most important question right now,
right.
is the connection between the world of consciousness and the world of the UAP. And obviously the UAP by definition, is such a broader phenomenon than the French officials saw it in 1999 when they called it the extraterrestrial hypothesis. It used to be that everybody just thought, oh, these are if they're not from here, they're visitors from some other planet.
Mhm.
That was, except for Jacques Vallée, who was like at another level from everybody else.
Yeah.
And now, it's become so clear, I think, that this phenomenon is something way more complicated and much broader than that. And included in that is the aspect of consciousness, health effects on people, psychological effects on people, which are even written into the NDAA legislation as aspects we need to study. I mean, that's how far that has come.
Right.
So, just to tell you guys that when I wrote my book, Surviving Death, and actually the documentary series on Netflix wasn't really mine. The book was mine. The book was based on my book, but I mean, the series on Netflix was based on my book, but a lot of it really wasn't based, was different than my book. And
Right.
I was a consultant on that, but I wasn't in charge of that documentary. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah,
Even though
you didn't have control over it. Yeah.
Yeah, but they did a great job overall. I'm really happy with it. I'm not discouraging anybody from watching it. I think it's really great. But so when I wrote that book, it was like I had absolutely no concept of a connection between anything that I was writing in that book and UFOs. I thought of them as completely different topics. And people in my people that I interact with, like Jeff Kripal from Rice University, would say, well, don't you see that there's a connection, or like, it just seemed obvious to them that there was a connection because they were way ahead of me. Even someone like Whitley Strieber, and it was just, I couldn't, because I had been so focused on the nuts and bolts reporting on this topic and really reporting on it in a way that was trying to reach, members of Congress and policymakers. You don't really talk about consciousness. You don't talk about weirdness and high strangeness when you're trying to make a point to policymakers about, hey, you guys, this stuff is real. You got to pay attention, right?
Right.
Don't want to go into that world. And so I hadn't really gone there. And I thought of my exploration of the evidence for survival of consciousness past death as being a completely separate topic. So I did a lot of research on that. I put it together in this book. And now after the book, and it came out in 2017, ironically, earlier in the same year that the story came out. And so now I'm really interested in that connection. And I feel like I have a lot to learn about it. I'm exploring it, learning from other people who like Jeff Kripal and others who have studied it, Diana Pasulka, and putting it together in my mind in terms of my own experience. And, I do recognize that consciousness plays a big role, and every time I hear something like, you might have a multiple witness case, for instance, where the witnesses see different things, even though there's a phenomenon there, but they see different things, or some of them will see it and some of them won't. Or, or cases where somebody does something for no reason they can explain, like they'll go outside in a way that they would never normally do, and and then suddenly there's a UFO there. I mean, there's some kind of interaction going on between the minds of the people and the objects. And also afterwards, and I'm this is all pretty elementary, but some witnesses and experiencers have all kinds of effects on their consciousness after having an encounter, where they have certain psychic abilities that open up for them that they didn't have before. They find themselves being more telepathic or having clairvoyant abilities or seeing telekinesis happening around them. So it affects people's minds, and somehow the minds are engaged with it. And then just to say, finally, I mean, the whole thing about the afterlife realm, if there is one, which there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that there's some kind of afterlife realm. Maybe it's an interdimensional realm, and it seems that perhaps some of these UAP dwell in that same interdimensional realm, because sometimes witnesses will encounter deceased people in UFO events, and people having near-death experiences will encounter what to them appear to be alien people, in the classic sort of sense. But there's overlap in these encounters between those two worlds. And I'd love to do more research, and I know there are people that have done research on those cases in which there's this intersection. So, that's really, really interesting as well. So that, if they're interdimensional objects of some sort that can come in and out of our physical space, I think a lot of the phenomena coming from the afterlife world, such as communications or effects that one might perceive coming from a deceased person, are also coming from some other dimension.
Right.
So, there's all these ways to think about it, but and I think Jacques Vallée, again, has been doing this for decades and has kind of been putting it all into one universe of thing. And I think more and more people are now coming around to seeing it that way. But again, when you're dealing with somebody from the Department of Defense who, or a member of Congress who you're trying to get to take it seriously, that's not the kind of stuff you talk about. Even though behind the scenes, of course, many of them are aware of these aspects of it. But there is a conversation that takes place in which you don't go there yet,
But I wonder how many years it's going to take, though, Leslie, because, you bring up the subject of, okay, we have visitors, and then, then we have to look at the abduction phenomenon, the cattle mutilations, crop circles, although we're not getting too many of those lately, but just a whole phenomenon that takes place with these sightings. Eventually Congress is going to have to look at that. I know that right now it's just the acceptance of that we're having some sort of crafts that we don't know the origins of, accepting that, but then the other stuff is going to eventually trickle down and they're going to have to look at that as well. But is that going to be years in the making? Like, are we looking at another 20 years before we can accept the whole phenomenon as being actually happening?
I mean, I can't imagine it'll take that long. Because they did, the fact that it's in the legislation, they say psychological and health effects. Now, those come from these very close encounter experiences.
Right.
And, they've been studied extensively by people like Kit Green and Gary Nolan, and, actually the biology of the impact of some of these encounters. Some of them are with high-level military people. So, they don't all involve the classic abduction scenario.
Right.
But, I think we will get there. I mean, my colleague Ralph Blumenthal did publish a story about, in the debrief. It wasn't in the New York Times, but for him to write about this topic and to write the book about John Mack, I think it's helped get it a little more into the mainstream. So it's so hard to know. I mean, there are very credible people writing and talking in the academic world about the whole universe of anomalous experiences, which includes the abduction experience, and putting it into a framework which is very accessible and not too weird, and seeing it, how it goes back through time and a lot of things. So I don't know. I'm hoping that it will, because I think that, as Jim Semivan has pointed out, these people who are having these encounters deserve the support and recognition of the community and of everyone. And they deserve the help that they might need to cope with it. And they shouldn't be stigmatized and ridiculed and disbelieved. I mean, it's really, really a human rights violation. I agree with that. So I'll do everything I can to help move it forward. But, if you do it too soon, it backfires. But of course, I'm sure that a lot of these Congress people are aware of all of this.
Right.
They're just not going to put it in legislation or talk about it, but they're aware of a lot more than we might think. And they've had classified briefings, multiple classified briefings. They've talked to lots of people. I mean, and people all over the intelligence community, they know what's going on. So I think it's a matter of letting it has to unfold somewhat gradually, also, so that we don't people aren't just shocked and panicked and terrified. There may be a logic to letting it unfold. And I think, if the next step is for these whistleblowers to come forward, which is what everybody's anticipating, and if some of that testimony has to do with crashed objects, that is a huge step forward. And maybe after that, we can move more into some of these other things. But I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball,
Right.
When you were mentioning the consciousness between people and entities, the first thing that came to mind was the aerial school phenomenon. And mainly because the kids that, like you said, some people see things, some people don't. Some people will both be in the same encounter, but have a different experience or get a different message. And that's what happened to the kids. Some of them got messages of, like, global warming and you're destroying your planet. Other people got messages of you need to, raise your consciousness and grow as a species. So even though it might have only been one or two entities with 60 kids or whatever the number was, they all seem to take something different from that. And those creatures simultaneously communicated with everybody, but the kids didn't feel like it was a group sighting. They felt like this was a one-on-one. That thing talked to me and told me this. And, and to your point of people like, John Mack and other people that are very reputable, they took a little bit of risk by getting even involved in that. And Harvard didn't come to his defense right away. Like, they kind of strung him out and let him be made a fool before they finally came and said, no, we respect John Mack. And if he wants to study this, then go ahead. So it's not always been an easy thing to get into. And to Jacques Vallée's point of bring the science, everything else will follow. So Jason, you said, how do you get Congress to take spirituality and consciousness seriously when it's even that much more taboo than flying saucers? Well, bringing that science, if we can get a little more documentation or a little more meat that we can then give to them, now they have to look at it because there's something there. So, it's the pioneers' work.
Yeah, it's probably happening already. And I just want to say about the aerial school event, though, I agree with you that, what you said, but I also think on the flip side of that, what's extraordinary about that case was the similarity in what all the kids experienced.
Yeah.
That they basically all described basically the same thing with their little variations.
Yeah.
And the messages they got were somewhat different, but they were also, some of them were the same.
Yeah.
So the actual event itself is just extraordinary given the numbers of witnesses that it had, and also the impact that it's had on those kids as adults, which is portrayed in this new film by Randy Nickerson called Aerial Phenomena.
Yeah, we had him on the show and we asked him about that. And that's basically what he had said. And he mentioned that, when John interviewed all the kids, if their stories were all identical, then it wouldn't be good, because then that's proof of collusion, or they all, told the same story over and over. They all kind of amalgamated into one. But to have those subtle variances and little differences that even if kids saw a car accident, they would all have a slightly different way of telling that story because they're so young. So that was also present in their recounting of this experience. So that's what John really went off of. It was it wasn't just what the kids were saying, it was how they said it. It was very natural and it was very believable,
Right, with a lot of emotion too.
Yeah. And even to this day, like the people that were in the movie, they got emotional when they went back to the Rua, Zimbabwe aerial school. And they I don't know if it was because that they weren't believed, if it was like, you're supposed to be proper here, we don't talk about those things, or maybe they had fundamentalist religious parents, for whatever. There was a lot of trauma. It wasn't like the aliens traumatized them, but the experience and the aftermath really traumatized them, and not being believed. I'm sure they were all told that you didn't see that, stop talking about it.
Yeah, a lot of them were. I don't think all of them were, but the ones that were, of course, it was much harder for them. Really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's a really, really powerful case, and that's one of the best cases, I think, for evidence for this close encounter kind of experience where there are actual beings involved. So it's all that stuff is so important.
And there's been a few. It's not the only school sighting. I know there was one in England, and I think Australia as well.
Yeah.
So
it's bizarre, but it happens.
It's like they sense that there's a vulnerability there and like a clean palette. If we can get a message out, well, to hell with the old ones. They're already so far gone. Maybe they start with the younger generations that we have a shot at getting through to them if the kids will tell them. I don't know.
Could be. I don't know. I mean, they probably, I don't know, but it happens. And it's very powerful. What those kids are unbelievable.
Yeah.
They're so believable. They're unbelievable in how believable they are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And you could see it in their faces, like they seen something. I can't get my kids to correlate a lie together to tell me who left their cup out in the living room. They can't even, they can't even lie together. So much less a school of how many kids saw it? Like 60 kids or something?
Or something like that.
Yeah. You can't.
More.
Yeah. It's crazy. As far as the whistleblower,
younger ones, which weren't included in the film.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And they tend not to be as affected as the older ones. I guess the older ones were really affected by it.
Maybe the younger ones were just too little to deal with,
Yeah.
really get it. They were like first graders or something.
Right.
So I don't think they were really even interviewed that much, but yeah, there were a lot of them, a lot of kids.
Yeah.
So we're looking forward to Whistleblowers coming out and forward. Do you think we're heading towards kind of like I keep mentioning this, like a Me Too of UFOs, like witnesses that are going to come out and, say, hey, I've had an experience here as well. Are we potentially looking at that, or is it still going to be hard for us to get whistleblowers to come out, especially with what is going on your side of the border right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how it's going to happen. I think the legislation is going to pass that will give them the protections to do this.
Right.
Then they will have to go in private sessions with the appropriate members of Congress to kind of screen what they want to say, because they still have to be careful about the national security aspects. There are still things that they do not want our adversaries to have access to, understandably so.
Mm-hmm.
And so, they'll have to go through a screening process with Congress. Then it's a question of how much, or whether it'll be made public or not. It'll take a while. There might be leaks, who knows? I forget what your question was, but the question was, is that likely to happen? I forget.
Yeah,
What
are we looking at
Yeah,
a kind of a movement of whistleblowers after this goes through?
I mean, there are plenty of them waiting in the wings. I do know that. And I think it also depends on whether there are factions out there who don't want this to happen.
Right.
And whether they will have any success in slowing it down, or, keeping certain witnesses out of the picture, and maybe they'll only bring in ones that are, less controversial, and maybe some Navy pilots who can talk about a sighting as opposed to somebody talking about a black program where they worked on a crash object. We just don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of differing perspectives behind the scenes of what should and shouldn't happen, and how quickly it should happen, and all that. But it seems that the members of Congress are on track to move this thing forward, and they're setting up legislation to make it possible. So I suspect a lot will happen in the next year or two on that level. But I have no more insight into the future than anybody else. I just talk to people and hear what they have to say, and then things are lining up for that to happen. That's for sure.
Yeah. We chatted with Ross Coulthard last week, and he basically said that a lot of this infighting and stone throwing that happens in social media, that if we get too carried away with that, we can prevent this thing from rolling out, because the people who were once willing to give us their information, they might just say, screw it. I saw what you did to Lou Elizondo and a few other guys. I'm good. Like, they don't need the hassle. So if it's not an open and welcoming environment to some respect, we run the risk of losing some of these people's testimony, because they just don't want to get, either they don't want to be the victim of that type of shelling, or they just, again, we're getting more taboo with the subject, and all the work to remove those layers is kind of going down the drain, because it's becoming a bunch of idiots just fighting amongst themselves, in the social media world anyways. But
yeah, I mean, I don't even go on Twitter hardly ever. So fortunately, I'm not exposed to all of that. I just hear about it from other people, but it doesn't sound like it's a very healthy thing. And obviously, if they want, obviously these are people who probably don't want witnesses to come forward. Maybe that's why they're doing this. I don't know. Yeah. But I hope that they are just not important enough, really, which I personally don't think they are, to have such an impact as to actually keep somebody from coming forward. And I just hope that these people out there just don't bother reading all that stuff. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's hard not to. I know that definitely Lou Elizondo was deeply affected by it, and I know that for a fact. So, yeah, it's a problem. I hope that people will tone it down on that level. I agree with Ross. It's definitely a problem. So I think that. And I think for scientists too, because I think the stigma is deepest it's deeper in the scientific world than it is with the military community at this point. I mean, that they've sort of been the last people to come around. And I still think to get more scientists to come forward, you don't want to be creating ridicule problems for them, obviously. Yeah. So I
Especially
just
their careers and, everything that goes behind their papers is all about their reputation. They don't want to, even if there's a small chance that that could happen, a lot of these guys will say, forget it. I mean, not everyone has that fortitude of Jacques Vallée to say, I know what I know, and you can't tear me down. But he's an anomaly, right? A lot of these other people, they are their name. Their entire book of work is their name, and they don't want that tarnished, or even just
yeah,
the thought that it could happen.
Gary Nolan's another example of
Yeah.
somebody
Yeah.
extremely successful who is just says, I don't care. I'm just dealing with data.
Yeah.
I don't care what people say. And
Yeah.
that's what you've got to do. I mean, I think the important thing is just not to engage with Twitter. Why even go on and read all this stuff?
Yeah.
I don't know what the point is.
Yeah, that's a
so
good point.
I don't even go on there. But I hope that fewer and fewer people do that. If you don't engage with it, then what joy are these people going to get out of doing what they do? Maybe they'll just stop if you ignore them. I don't know. I'm not part of that universe, so I don't know how really. But yeah, I mean, I think as long as you're a scientist with data, then you should be fine. And
Nice.
look at Gary Nolan and look at Avi Loeb as two shining lights who hopefully will encourage other scientists to come forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What advice could you give people that want to investigate this on a journalistic approach? Because there's a lot of people that might be listening to this that want to contribute to, the whole movement of ufology or disclosure. They might write blogs and have different medias. What advice would you give people when they're researching this subject?
When you mean in how to research it, or
Yeah, just how to research or how to approach it, because we don't have enough people teaching us how to do that. I fall for stuff all the time, fake stuff, and I've learned to really, take my time with it, analyze it, make sure I don't fall for it first and foremost like I used to. I like to say I used to. I still fall for stuff. What advice could you give us just on how to broach a subject or research a subject without falling into these traps?
well, I would say, first of all, make sure it's correct. Whatever the information is that you're concerned about, make sure you can get it corroborated, that
Right.
there's evidence to back it up. If it's just a claim, and I've dealt with this since for 22 years. If it's just a claim, it might be true. But if it's just a claim, don't write about it, because there's no way that you can verify it. There's no corroboration. There's nobody to stand up and, to do journalism, you have to have more than one source for a story. You got
Right.
to have documents or multiple sources, and they've got to be very credible. So if somebody just has a claim, and you can't verify it, and there are so many interesting claims out there, but if it can't be verified, like for me, I just don't even hardly look into something that doesn't have that solid base in fact. And in terms of it's not so much whether it's a fact or not, it's whether it can be backed up and substantiated, right? And even if it's true and enticing and fascinating, you just can't put it out there unless it has that, and you might try to find it. If something really fascinates you, but there's no corroboration, there's no documentation, you might ask other sources, the people that are on the inside, or other people out in the UFO community, if they can verify it. What do they think? Try to gather other people's opinions on it. But basically, we're just stuck if we can't, you might have a fascinating deathbed confession from somebody, for instance, who says they saw the bodies at Roswell and they did this and that and that. It's just somebody's story unless you have something to back it up. And therefore, it's not something that the realm of journalism can really take on. That's the problem.
Right. So you have the UFO world that adheres to these, deathbed confessions. And on the journalistic side, you can't, take it for what it is because there's nothing to back it up.
Exactly. We cannot go to the New York Times and say, hey, this anonymous source over here just said this. Or even if he's on the record, he said this, made this amazing claim, but he's one person telling a story, no documentation, nobody else to say what he's saying is true.
Right.
I was there too. I saw the same thing. Anything like that. It's just a story. And that's not saying that it isn't true. It doesn't mean that the person rejecting it, like myself, because it's it's just the world I operated in. There's certain requirements you have to be a journalist.
Right.
And it's not about whether the story is true or not. It's about whether you have enough documentation to at least put forward the likelihood that it's true. And so it's not like I'm saying I don't believe these people. I just can't work with material like that. So I think that for people, who write blogs and so on, if it's just something to look out for, to try to get documentation and corroboration, and ask other people who might have some expertise about what they think. And then, if you want to get out more, I would suggest to people trying to maybe write op-ed pieces for your local, like if you live in a town or a small city that has a local newspaper, you might be able to write like an opinion piece for that paper. If you're writing blogs anyway, it might not be that hard to turn it into something that your newspaper would be interested in. And maybe, if more people did that, it's sort of a way of starting a groundswell in all these local communities, because the local newspapers are often more open to that kind of thing. Although nowadays, I guess everything's online. I don't know.
That's true. That's true.
Anymore. It's just all online. So I don't know. It's a different world than when I was all through when I first got started, all through the 2000s, I was writing, these op-ed pieces for newspapers that actually were physical newspapers. And then there was something called the wire services, where the newspaper would send it out on a certain wire service so that it could be picked up by any other paper. And my stories were picked up all over the place. Nowadays, we just have the internet, so it's a different world. But, so now I guess it's picked up all over the internet.
Yeah.
But in those days, it was picked up by reputable newspapers. There was this separate category, and they were like hard copies, I remember, like, when my stories were picked up all over in these other papers, I'd try to find out which ones they were. And then I'd go call them up, and they'd send me a hard copy, and I put it in my files,
Yeah.
It was
just laminated
Well, some of them are really special. I've got some New York Times stuff framed, but I mean, I just made sure I wanted to get copies of them. And the way to do that was to get the actual hard copy, and it's just, yeah. So now I don't know how it works now to write op-ed pieces, but I do think that if people create relationships with their local newspapers, that might be an outlet.
That's a great.
We asked Ross Coulthard too, like, what's it like being a journalist? And he says, I get a lot of hate mail from people that are like, where's your proof? Where's this? Where's that? And he's like, I'm not a scientist. I don't owe the scientific community anything. He said, I'm a journalist. And many times journalists, because they're the first ones to report on something, maybe the information is a little bit off, or it needs to be corrected at a later date, and there's mistakes made. And he says, but we have that freedom to do that because we're the front lines, even like the Gulf War and everything. Sometimes, the ticker would say one thing and then it would quickly be corrected, because as information is coming in, you're forming this stuff and just trying to grasp as much of it as you can. So I kind of like his attitude of, I'm a journalist. I'm allowed to make a mistake. Nobody knows about this shit. Leave me alone. I'm not a scientist. I don't owe you that type of, I'm not creating work to submit for peer review. So I don't owe the world that, because I'm not saying that that's what I'm doing. That's not my mission. My mission is, here's some interesting things to ponder. And I really like that perspective of it. And in terms of, you're a little more, because I think you've been doing this so long, and I think you're used to what can happen if you don't have your facts straight, that you just come correct now. And if you can't get the information you're going to need, you don't touch it. But I think that maybe that comes from a different time, or from, things are just changing now and people are very quick to jump down your throat. So it's good to define what your mission is, right?
Yeah, and I think Ross has access to media that gives him a lot more leeway. When he does a show for Channel 7 in Australia, he has a lot more leeway than we have at the New York Times in terms of what he can report. So there's a huge difference there. As long as, Ralph and I are sticking with the New York Times, which we are for now, because we know the impact it can have, it restricts what we can do and how much of it we can do. in a way that Ross doesn't really have to deal with as much, because he has a station behind him that allows him to sort of be more expansive. So that's part of the difference too. And he's going to probably get more of that kind of hate mail than Ralph and I are going to get, because, you know, we're so vetted by the Times.
Yeah.
Everything every single sentence has to be, you know, absolutely checked out and backed up and verified and everything else. So there really isn't, I mean, there have been some errors in our stories and they've been corrected, or things that
Yeah, it happens.
one thing that Harry Reid wanted to have changed. I don't think it was an error, but he wanted us to change it, so we did, you know, things like that. But Ross is able to take a lot more risk, I guess is my point, in what he says than we are. Yeah. Because he's working for a different kind of media than we are.
Yeah, a little bit more looser on the way that they do things, right? So
yeah, or just has, you know, a broader, more, you know, less rigorous kind of controlling approach than the New York Times does. A big difference. Yeah, it's not any less. It's just different.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, the advantage is it gives him the ability to bring a lot more out than we can do. And, you know, a lot of really interesting stuff that he brings out all the time. So I'm really glad he's out there doing that.
Yeah. And I could see, you know, from the back to back, he's got a lot more of a, I can say this, you know, he can just bluntly say, like on his UFO Twitter rant that he had, which I loved it. Like you could tell he's just now at the point where he's shooting it straight, which is awesome to see, right?
It's good to see. Gave him permission to say whatever he wanted. We said, listen, Ross, if you want to clarify something or get something off your chest, you go ahead. And boy, did he ever.
Yeah.
Leslie did it with force.
He did. Leslie, what's coming up on December 3rd? There's a conference that you're attending. Want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a very cool thing, I think. Well, this is a conference that's organized by the Experiencer Group, which is kind of like a support group for experiencers. I don't know how else to describe it, but a wonderful, wonderful group. And they did a conference last Saturday. I guess it was today's Sunday. So last weekend, October 8th. In New York, which was their first one. And it's basically organized by Jay King and James Iandoli, who are both members of the Experiencer Group. And so I'm sort of helping them organize the next one a little bit. And the last one was so successful. They got such great, and I was there and I thought it was fantastic. They got great feedback. Nice. And Gary Nolan was there, which was amazing. He did like a 1-hour Q&A. It has a live audience, but then it's also live streamed. So they're doing another one on December 3rd. And also in New York, which is so great because most conferences don't take place on the East Coast. But there were people that came to this one from all over. People flew in from California, Chicago, even the UK. It was amazing, all over the place. So far they have myself and Ralph Blumenthal are both going to be there, and it'll be interesting for us to be able to be together, you know, because we don't do that very often. And Jeff Kripal from Rice University, who's just absolutely an incredible speaker and writer and expert on anomalous experiences. And a woman named Sharon Rowlett, who's a philosopher, kind of. She's written a book on coincidence and synchronicity. I guess she's a philosopher by training. You know, she's in the academic world. She's a professor. She's been a professor. I think she's now independent, but she's also on the board of the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, which I was on the board of previously. Right. And anyway, this book that she's written on coincidence and synchronicities is really amazing. So she's going to talk about that. And then Whitley Strieber will be there as well, doing his thing. And then there's one other incredible guest, incredible speaker who I'm not allowed to tell you yet who it is, because they're going to announce it at the end of I think this coming week, they will announce it. But it's going to be really interesting to have this person there too. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a fantastic gathering of people and speakers. Nice. Running the gamut from the weird, you know, the world of Whitley Strieber, to the more hardcore stuff, which I do and which our other guest does as well, who I'm not allowed to name. Right. So it's going to kind of cover this whole universe from different approaches of you know, experience and the nature of the phenomenon itself. So, and what's happening in Washington and all of that. It's all going to be included.
And
And-
you're speaking as well, Leslie?
Yeah,
Okay, nice.
yeah, yep.
Louis, do you have any final questions for our guest today?
No, I don't. I just want to extend a very warm thanks to Leslie Kean for giving us an hour of your time. I know you're a very busy person. You probably have paid gigs. This wasn't one of them, nor for us.
No.
But we do this out of a genuine curiosity and an interest. We were saying before the show, this is our virtual living room, and we like having these conversations with thousands of people watching and just cool, bright people to give us their perspective. And we really thank you for coming on the show. We'd love to have you again sometime. And where can people follow you before we close?
I know, because I'm not in this Twitter universe.
Exactly. Where do they find you?
Follow you. Well, I have a Facebook page, so I'm back in the archaic world of Facebook, and I that's probably the best place. And I have a website which is just my name.com, lesliekane.com. Last name spelled Kean. But my author Facebook page is kind of where most of my stuff happens, and I apologize that I'm not on it more. Sometimes I'm just got too many things going on and I'm not on it all that much. But what I like about my Facebook page is that we really do get into discussions and comments there that I feel are very solid and thoughtful, and people can write longer comments, whereas I think on Twitter,
yeah, you're limited.
Character limit.
Comments, people just throw in these sort of quick little things. And so I feel like I like to stay on Facebook because it's thoughtful in that way. And I guess Instagram is even worse than Twitter. I don't know. I just not into the whole social media thing very much, but I do the Facebook thing. So yeah. I hope people will come on. And as soon as we have the announcement about the conference, as soon as they have it, I will post it on my Facebook page and everyone will find out about it. Yeah. So
we'll make sure to reshare it and post it as well.
For sure.
Thank you guys for having me on. It was the time flew by, and I think you're doing a great podcast. I really appreciate it, and I hope more people in Canada will start listening.
Yeah, us as well. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. We appreciate it.
Great to see you guys. Take care.